Okay, the first question for today is regarding Bible translation. It says this: What is your view of the Legacy Standard Bible? I heard you attended the Master's Seminary and the LSB was translated by their faculty. For Mark 16 and John 7, the LSB uses brackets but does not make comments like the ESV. You said you would preach on these verses at some time. Okay, well, let's start with just talking about translation philosophy in general. We are translating from Greek in the New Testament and Hebrew in the Old Testament and Aramaic at some points of Daniel. And the question is, are we going to translate it kind of more literal and go word for word, or are we going to translate it more kind of thought for thought, kind of more dynamic? And so that's led to translation philosophies that are kind of lean towards the formal equivalency versus dynamic equivalency. And I'm going to illustrate this with two passages from two different translations. So this is the Young's literal translation. It's by its name, very literal, very word for word, and as so, it sacrifices a little bit of readability. So here's John 3:16 to 18 in this translation. For God did so love the world that his Son, the only begotten, he gave, that every one who is believing in him may not perish, but have life age during. For God did not send his Son to the world that he may judge the world, but that the world may be saved through him. He who is believing in him is not judged, but he who is not believing has been judged already because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. So you can hear you can understand it. It makes sense, but definitely not smooth flowing English like you would read in a normal book. Now here's John 3:16 to 18 in the Message. So this is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. This aims for thought type of translation and takes all sorts of freedoms when it comes to interpretation. So here we go. This is how much God loved the world. He gave his Son, his one and only Son. And this is why, so that no one need be destroyed. By believing in him, anyone can have a whole and lasting life. God didn't go to all the trouble of sending his Son merely to point an accusing finger, telling the world how bad it was. He came to help, to put the world right again. Anyone who trusts in him is acquitted. Anyone who refuses to trust him has long since been under the dead sentence without knowing it. And why? Because of that person's failure to believe in the one-of-a-kind Son of God when introduced to him. So you can see that is massively different translation, but it's not using the same philosophy. In English, most of our versions are kind of going to strike that balance right there in the middle between formal equivalency and dynamic. When it comes to the LSB, the Legacy Standard Bible, that is intended really to be an update of the New American Standard Bible. And so it's going to definitely lean more to the word for word kind of translation in terms of its philosophy. But it's a great translation. Many of the English translations are great translations. I like to use all of them and just kind of get a feel. One little Bible reading tip: when you come across really significant differences between the translations, usually that's an indicator you've run into something interesting in the Greek or Hebrew. So dig in when you see that. Now, the second part of the question has to do with textual criticism. And what I mean that not higher criticism, but lower criticism. In other words, how do we recover the original text? We have what is known as families of manuscripts. You have, for example, the Alexandrian family of manuscripts, an older family, the Byzantine family of manuscripts. You've got even things like the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Masoretic text. We have even things like the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the LXX, called the Septuagint. So all of these families of manuscripts come to us, and the question is always, well, which one is the most reliable? When we get to John chapter 7, that's the story of the woman who was caught in adultery, and he who was without sin cast the first stone, that whole section. Or when we get to the end of Mark, there's a section there about handling snakes, and it's really weird. And the question is always, are those original? Are those sections part of the original text? And there's reason to think that perhaps they're not. Perhaps they've crept in through the copying process because certain families of manuscripts don't have those sections. So we'll talk about that when we get to Mark chapter 8. That's just kind of a preview. With the end of Mark. That's just a preview of what's to come. We'll face that issue head on, address those issues, and help you think a little bit more in depth when it comes to understanding the process by which we got our English Bible. But hopefully that helps understand translations and philosophies and some of the issues that underlie.